143rd episode of Reverse Swept Radio. I'm Andy Ryan.
And I'm Toby Chad.
It's 41 years to the day since an MCC member grabbed umpire David Constant by the scruff of the neck. Coming off after a fifth failed pitch inspection, the member's frustration boiled over. The MCC took the matter very seriously, sending the member a stiff letter of rebuke.
I mean, it is a dangerous job being an umpire, isn't it? I mean, you can't really consider yourself to be held responsible for the condition of the pitch on a kind of grey August day, but, you know, apparently this particular MCC member, probably a few bottles of claret down, decided that another situation was taking place.
It's the grabbing by the scruff of the neck that I like. I feel like that is the exact correct way for an MCC member to show their distaste.
Or maybe kind of batting at someone with a long-handled umbrella. So in this, the 143rd episode of Reverse Swept Radio, well, Andy's been at Lord's today. He's looking a bit wind-beaten rather than suntanned after that. He's going to tell us all about the experience. I'm going to be diving into some of the wonderful tradition of making excuses in cricket. I've certainly made a few excuses for my own cricket. And we're going to be reviewing Alan Ross's masterly 1957 book, Cape Summer and the Australians in England. So, Andy, a day at Lord's, how was it?
So it's the first time I've been there since the pandemic began, and however many times I go to Lord's, I'll never stop being a little in awe of it. You walk through the Grace Gates, you look up, and it's special every time. And after being the first time in 2 years, I think it's never looked better. It was very nice to return to the familiar traditions of county cricket. So there are a host of foods that I only ever eat at cricket. I think this is probably good for my long-term health. So it was a welcome back to the Scotch egg, the pork pie, and the Percy pigs.
All from M&S, I imagine, given that combination.
All from M&S, and consumed in a sort of, there was no particular structure, the no sort of savoury sweet division. Actually, one of my friends really upped the snacking game. He brought mature cheddar cheese sticks, which were an interesting addition to the cricket snacking canon. Bad light stopped play, which allowed us to enjoy the age-old tradition of grumbling about how it was just as light as it had been all day, and then staring at the clouds to try to guess if it was going to get any lighter, like amateur meteorologists.
There is quite an extraordinary experience, isn't there, of being at the cricket, and you never watch the weather quite so hard. It's the same with rain, where you're always trying to judge whether it's getting lighter or heavier, and whether it's something that's just a temporary squall, or it's light over there and that's where the wind's kind of coming from. It does do funny things to your brain sitting there intently staring at the weather on it.
Well, at least there's something reasonably binary about rain, whereas with light, the sort of anger it can elicit because everyone feels that it's not as dark as the umpires are telling them. The final tradition that was lovely to see was everyone's very strong opinion on each of the LBWs, despite us being about 50 yards away down at third man, but that didn't hold us back.
And so how was the cricket itself?
Very decent game. So Middlesex have been struggling this season, and they found themselves in trouble, 14 for 3 early on, and then recovered to 218 for 5 by the close. So we also had the sight of Robbie White, who has fallen twice in the 90s this season, or at least this year, and has then went on to make 100 today. And you felt there was particular relief in his celebration, his first career 100, and got a very, very warm response from the crowd.
So it's a Monday. I don't want to get you in trouble, but did you pull a sickie, or did you take a day of leave?
It's
because surely pulling a sickie to go to the cricket is as much a tradition as eating Percy pigs and Scotch eggs.
I would obviously not be able to comment on that, but today was a bank holiday. You're so out of touch with your English roots.
Of course, I thought you were going to not be able to comment on it, but I was just going to say you are looking a bit peaky. So if any of your employers are listening, then they would know that. In fact,
cricket is obviously the best way to recover.
Indeed, and cricket is the only way to recover, I think.
And you have been at a somewhat frustrating time in the Australian summer due to ongoing COVID. You've been continuing to find cricket amidst the gloom.
Well, it is. I mean, it is a frustrating time. Not only because it's not summer; it's the middle of winter. But we have been in lockdown for gosh, what is it? I don't know how many weeks it is. 10 weeks now, and it's going to kind of go on for longer. Who knows how much longer? And it looks like it's going to kind of start eating into the summer, and therefore the likelihood of being able to get back together and actually play some cricket together. But the good news, the silver lining, is that I discovered there's a kind of government app where you can look at your 5 kilometre radius. So we're all allowed 5 kilometres from our homes at the moment, and you're allowed to meet up with one other person for exercise. And a friend found an app where you can kind of overlay your radius with that of someone else and see where your 5 kilometres overlap. And through this kind of joyful serendipity, there are these cricket nets within this overlap of my best friend, and so we've turned up at these nets. They're kind of sandwiched between a dog racing track and some railway arches. It's a kind of salubrious place.
Can we next visit? Can we get a photo? This sounds like a very atmospheric
It is quite
setting.
atmospheric. It's under this enormous, absolutely enormous fig tree, and there are these kind of anything on the that ends up on the offside is covered in. There are sort of these barbed railings you have to climb over in order to get the ball back, and we had quite an amusing time a couple of weekends ago where I genuinely thought I was going to end up in A&E with because my friend climbed over the railings to get the ball back but got stuck on top of them, and I thought this is absolute kind of vintage. Do you remember those old Crime Stoppers episodes where you saw horrible gory ways that people used to get injured? I thought that just absolutely flashed before my eyes. In fact, I ended up waking up in the middle of the night thinking about it. Anyway, it's a bit of an improvised kind of setup. We have to improvise the stumps. We don't have any pads, and there's nothing worse for your technique than netting without pads on.
Very true.
Where your first instinct is get your legs out of the way rather than get your front foot forward. But these Sunday net sessions have rapidly become a highlight of our week, and it seems that we're not alone. We often have to wait for others to finish. Other usually rather more competent cricketers. Most noteworthy is a kind of 20-something woman who turns up religiously every week with her coach, which is quite impressive.
And are you working on any particular aspects of your technique? Any surprises that we need to warn?
Batting and bowling is what I'm working on at the moment.
You've not.
I'm quite enjoying bowling little.
Not working on. You haven't been listening to the England cricketers. They're all working on their wobble seam. You're not working on your wobble seam.
My wobble seam I perfected years ago. It's the upright seam that I'm really struggling with. But I'm actually quite enjoying bowling little leg cutters at the moment, which is quite. I tried to bowl off spin for a while and that went horribly wrong. So it just depends on different days. I'm very mercurial. On different days, I'll turn into different types of cricketer.
It moved a mile. The umpire was blind. I had a bee in my helmet. We've all made them. Cricket is a sport filled with excuses, and Toby today is going to be taking us through some of the greatest ones and some of the psychology behind them.
I was reading an obituary of the late Ted Dexter last week, and I was amused to encounter an anecdote from when he was chairman of the English selectors. So in 1989, England were thrashed 4-0 in the Ashes. And in the press conference after that, he was asked specifically what mistakes he had made as the chairman of the selector that had contributed towards that. He couldn't name any mistakes that he'd made. Instead, he chose to say that lines of Venus were in the wrong juxtaposition. Now, I'm not totally sure. No one seems to be totally sure whether he's joking here. But I will stop at nothing for the sake of Reverse Rep Radio listeners. I spent quite a lot of time on an astronomy website trying to work out whether Venus would actually have had anything to do, according to astronomy, or is it astrology? I don't know. Would have had anything.
It's definitely astrology. Yeah, true, I would like to defend the good honour of the astronomers out there.
Okay, so astrology, whether Venus had anything to do with England's performances in those Ashes, and it turns out that it almost certainly didn't. But the point isn't necessarily the nature of planetary alignment here. The point is more Dexter's kind of speed to grasp for any kind of excuse, however ridiculous that excuse might be. I was thinking about excuses again a couple of days later after watching Kohli talk after India's latest innings defeat against England in the Test series. He was asked this rather marvellous question by a reporter. He was asked, why had India failed when the batting conditions were beautiful, but they had battled through without losing wickets in dim light when the ball was swinging? And what the reporter was basically saying is, don't make an excuse of the conditions. He was taking the conditions out of there as an excuse. Kohli didn't use the conditions as an excuse. He said that India were not on the money and England were. Still, the reporter pressed him, was your decision at the toss, was that the right one? And Kohli declined to take any responsibility, again just saying England had played better. And what was interesting about this is Kohli was looking as though he wasn't making any excuses. He was saying, I'm not going to make any excuses, we played badly. But he was actually using that as an excuse for his own decisions and refusing to take any culpability himself around that.
There's a really interesting thing here about what we do and don't expect of captains, because this happened after the second test at Lord's where Joe Root did take full responsibility and England had that horrible mad morning where they got everything wrong against India's tail. And you can sort of argue it a bit both ways, because I thought it was very impressive, Root stepping up, and I thought it was good. But there was a little part of me that felt, well, hang on, he's got some experienced bowlers behind him, etc. Should he be taking all the flack for this? And it's an interesting thing there around particularly what we do and don't expect of our captains.
Well, exactly. And I think excuses are so often a part of the way that we talk about the game of cricket. And so this got me thinking about that phenomenon and about why we make so many excuses in cricket and why those excuses so often appear to be frankly overthought. And so, again, stopping at nothing for the sake of Reverse Swept Radio listeners, I've been reading a book called A Critical Introduction to Sports Psychology. And in this book, there's an interesting analysis of golf, which I think is quite applicable to cricket in some senses. And it's analysis of golf in terms of why the sport is so conducive to overthinking and therefore ultimately to making excuses and blaming other things. So the first reason the authors say that golf falls into this category is because it's an untimed sport that takes as long as it takes. So it takes a long time to do it. You set out thinking it's going to take a certain time, and it can often take a lot longer. And that puts people into a weird mental space when they're playing it. And people get upset when golf takes longer than you think. And cricket is exactly the same, particularly in the test format. You have no idea whether it's going to be over in 3 days or it's going to be over in 5 days. There's no way of kind of adequately framing your expectation of the game as there is in football, where it's absolutely going to take 90 minutes plus 7 minutes stoppage time or something like that.
And I think adding and linked to that, there's also this feature that I guess in both golf and cricket, you don't always know how quickly you'll have the chance to make amends for something. So if, for example, you're a batsman and you throw your wicket away cheaply, your team may win by an innings and you may not get to bat again. Yep. And that's so there's that sort of unfortunate unpredictability.
Well, particularly with there being press conferences at the end of every day of a test, say, you can have a disastrous day one day and then you're making every excuse under the sun, and then the next day you could have had the most brilliant day on a pitch that a team has ever had and redeemed it all, and that day before has been totally forgotten about. So the second thing about golf is that you have to take full responsibility for your own performance. So the way that your opponent plays, aside from whatever kind of pressure that might put on you, your opponent actually has nothing to do with your round of golf. It's a totally solitary thing. So you have to, if you want to find an excuse, you can't just say the opposition was better than me. That's not an excuse in golf. You have to find something else to blame. You have to blame your shoes or the wind direction or the nature of the putting greens or the fact that the head of your 9-iron fell off or something like that. Now, this is less directly applicable to cricket, where clearly the opposition has more of an impact on the game. However, cricket is one of those games where there are so many variable factors outside you and the opposition. The pitch is a huge factor. The weather is a huge factor. The state of the ball is a huge factor as well.
I think in village and club cricket, I think it is nearly always the pitch gets the blame. I mean, the umpire gets the blame a reasonable amount, but for dodgy dismissals, it's often the pitch's fault.
Well, it is, and you also think these often these factors are a great leveler as well, particularly on in one day games. Everyone's kind of playing on the same pitch, and it's very rare that a pitch will change from one side to the next. The third thing about golf, which I think is very applicable to cricket, is that you have a lot of time to think. So on a golf course, apparently you spend less than 20% of the time that you're out playing a round of golf actually applying yourself to the business of playing a shot. In cricket, it must be way less time than that you're actually involved in the action during a game. I mean, fielding, when you think about it, is a really curious phenomenon because you have to be alert every single ball. And yet, what proportion of balls, if you're not the keeper, probably 1 in 30, I don't know what the statistics are, 1 in 30 balls might come to you in the field. And so this kind of stop-start situation that you're in, but also the fact that you just have an awful lot of time, whether you're standing at the non-striker's end or standing in the field, you have an awful lot of time to think, and therefore this gives lends itself towards a phenomenon of overthinking and therefore coming up with these kind of extraordinary excuses in order to justify what's going on the pitch, whereas in a shorter timed match you're more likely just to be much more direct and spontaneous about analysing what's actually happening.
I think there's also this feature that it is a game. I mean, I often think, particularly batting, maybe to a greater extent than bowling, even the best players fail the entire time. You look at sort of a run of scores of a Tendulkar or whatever, even when they're in reasonable form, and there's plenty of failures. And I wonder if almost just to kind of protect your sense of sanity, sometimes you need to say, this is not all on me.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's also this interesting question of when an excuse is not an excuse. When is an excuse a reason? And this is a debate, a rabbit hole we could go down forever. But I did read an interesting blog. It was not a cricket blog. It was a more generalist sports blog in which someone was talking about sporting excuses, kind of ridiculous sporting excuses. And on this list, they gave an example of when England lost to South Africa in the Test series in 1999, and one of the England players after the game said one of the contributing factors had been low cloud cover. Now, to this blogger, this was kind of a ludicrous example of an excuse along the same lines as the alignment of Venus in the planetary system. But we know that obviously low cloud cover does have a significant effect. If suddenly clear blue skies when you're bowling and then low cloud cover when you're batting, absolutely is going to make it harder to do that. So I think reasons and excuses are sometimes slightly hard to separate as well. Now, finally, I just have to share what I think is the best cricketing excuse that I've come across, which came from 2001, where it was a tournament on the subcontinent. Sri Lanka had reached the final and were playing against Pakistan, and at the very late notice they had to change their kit because their sponsor dropped out, so they had to get new shirts and trousers made with different branding. No one thought twice about it. Before the game, Sri Lanka went on to lose. They scored 173. Pakistan won by 5 wickets. It was a 50 over game. Quite soon after the game, reports began circulating that the Sri Lankan skipper Jayasuriya was heard complaining that the trousers were so short that they had to improvise extensions in the dressing room, and that the t-shirts were all way too tight. And he directly put this down to the reason for why they'd lost this game.
How do you improvise extensions to your trousers?
Goodness knows, my research didn't throw up any detailed. I did look at some pictures of the game, and it looked like they were pretty normally dressed, to be honest. I also read lots of reports of the game, and all of them talk about the excellence of the Pakistani bowling. None of them say that there was this kind of curious situation where the Sri Lankan batsmen couldn't lift their arms above their heads because their shirts were too tight, and that was what really kind of impeded their ability to play. But I think this is just a great example of probably when you do get thrashed, that kind of little niggling thing at the back of your head means that you will grasp for any possible excuse, any possible reason to then turn into the overriding factor behind why the result hasn't gone your way. The review, and for this episode we have been reading Alan Ross's 1957 book Cape, Summer and the Australians in England. Alan Ross was the Observer's cricket correspondent. He was a poet and an editor of the London magazine for many decades. This book tells the story of Australia's 1956 visit to England and then subsequently England's 1956-7 tour of South Africa. Andy, what do you make of the way that Alan Ross chooses to structure this book?
So at some level, it's very simple. We've got match reports done in a kind of day-by-day structure. And then you have the wandering meanderings of Ross and sometimes the teams in between games. You have, I guess, one advantage in some ways you have that Ross has is that a tour really was an endless endeavour in those days. So you have lots of
the number of games is extraordinary, isn't it? You know, the warm-ups of the Australians and England go for sort of 5 weeks or so, and you get this amazing chance to have a really thorough look at the team in the long form, and then even between tests, the number of games that are happening, you know, is very much something from a bygone era that we don't see anymore.
Absolutely, and it has the wonderful thing that it gives Ross the opportunity to travel. It raises really interesting questions that he constantly comes back to about, well, how seriously should England be taking and how seriously should Australia be taking all the tour games? But I guess at its core, this is about writing about it's match reports at its heart. And how would you describe his approach?
So they are match reports. They are the kind of things that you might read in a newspaper reporting on a day's play, and obviously he is a newspaper man in many ways. One of the things that kind of slightly got to me, and I suppose this is as a result of the fact that I don't know these series intimately, so I don't necessarily know myself what's going to happen on each day's play or indeed in each test, is that each day begins with a spoiler. So each match begins with a scorecard, so you see the full scorecard before you start reading about the match, and I don't have the self-restraint not to look at that scorecard. And then secondly, each day's play starts with a kind of 3 lines of, you know, Australia started promisingly today, but we're in a heap by the end of it, and then you go into the day's play. And that, for me, was a little bit of a kind of disappointment, only because the pacing of his narrative is so strong, and he really grips you with every day's play that you kind of are on tenterhooks, not knowing which way the game's going to turn at any moment. So to know from the very beginning where that is. I mean, did you share that sense of wanting some more suspense in it?
Yeah, well, I guess the challenge is, I suppose some of these were written for an audience that just wanted to know straight away, I guess like a news report. But I completely agree on the pacing point, because he does tell the story here of some wonderful test matches. We have Jim Laker's 19 wickets, for example, but a couple of them are pretty average test matches, and I think it's the real testament to a good writer that you find the story of a test match from 70 odd years ago completely compelling because of the way he tells it. He also is very happy as a tourist, and I think you see him treating that part of his writing as seriously as his cricket writing. I mean, what did you take from that?
One of the things that his kind of writing on travelling around, both around England but also around South Africa, reminded me of really strongly was the recently late travel writer Jan Morris. That kind of engagement with a place that kind of completely leaves the author out of it. We actually very rarely, with a couple of notable exceptions, we very rarely hear about, Ross. It's not about a lot of travel cricket and travel writing nowadays, which is about the adventures of that individual in this country. It's very much about that country, its culture, its history. And I found myself actually learning a lot about South Africa. Yes, Ross has a slightly, a mildly colonialist lens that hasn't, in some instances, dated very well, but he is writing in the 1950s, so really, what can you expect? But I just thought it was so refreshing that it wasn't just about, anecdotes. We read a book recently about Irish cricket where there are a lot of anecdotes about drinking with the players. There's very, very little of that, and more of a genuine sense of wonder at visiting these countries.
there clearly was a lot of drinking, but you're right that it's not sort of front and center. He clearly was traveling with a budget that a modern journalist could only dream of. But I think it's very impressive that amidst the play that he clearly had, he doesn't ignore the politics and the difficulty of the situation. One may lunch in the Rand Club, play tennis in the afternoon, bridge in the evenings, and discuss over endless whiskies anything under the sun. But the shadow remains, the issue returns, moral problems have a way of refusing to be shelved, which I think captures very well this sense of he's here on a holiday, here on a working holiday, but that's not enough to escape the seriousness of the situation.
I think that's also, that quotation is also a really great example of his kind of understatement. You know, he's very rarely someone who's sort of histrionic in his opinions, and that extends to the cricket pitch as well. He's not someone who, particularly when it comes down to the fact that England ended up drawing that South African series 2-2, which was quite remarkable at that point. England hadn't lost overseas to South Africa possibly ever by that point, and so to draw a series was a very very big deal. And what Ross doesn't do throughout, in that instance and also in the Ashes series, he doesn't use his sort of platform, as it were, as an opportunity to take pot shots at decisions that he doesn't agree with. It's clear that he doesn't agree with certain decisions, particularly that Peter May as captain has made, but he's not looking for those kind of those sort of headlines, I suppose, in a way which makes it much more which makes his writing much more considered. He's much more interested in what happened and being a beautiful describer of that than sort of recreating it in his own image and saying what he would have done if he was on the pitch.
I wonder, and I don't want to go too down the classic everything was better in the old days, but I do wonder if this is a sort of pressure of modern journalism, that you want your columnists to come up with the controversy that you can, and perhaps Ross and others at the time were operating in an environment where they were free to not be controversial. We can't leave Ross without talking about his writing itself. And as we noted at the start, he was a poet as well. I think we could quote plenty of lines here. I was struck by, he describes a pitch that rarely misbehaved. So, you got the occasional bouncer. Perhaps as for tired businessmen who like a night out, a single frolic sufficed for a long time. And this struck me as just being so unexpected as a simile. But also, there was within it, he was writing about a cricket pitch and yet still taking a real jab at tired businessmen as well. Somehow.
There's a real sort of playfulness to the way that he writes, and a real kind of, again, you don't get the sense of any bitterness. There's a kind of affection, there's a kind of affection there too. I loved his description of the Australian Mackay, who quotes, "Patrolled at third man as if on the lookout for Red Indians, but batting, prodded and pushed like a piece of Meccano. His locomotion had gone awry." Again, it's a completely unexpected metaphor, but I think we all kind of know what that would look like, and there's a certain kind of vividness to the language as well. Just as Keith Miller, who makes swear cuts with the casual indulgence of a bridegroom cutting the cake, which is just, and I think one of the things that I love about this book, and one of the reasons why I'd really recommend it, is that it doesn't just feel like a piece of cricketing history, and you don't just read it for the beauty of the language, powerful though that is. It really feels like you're watching these games and they're kind of stepping through them day by day. It's actually a really sort of real thrill to get to know some of these cricketers in this way, in a way that I think is actually quite rare in cricket writing.
And I think a real reminder that the match report in its sort of purest form can still be the really sort of highest form, I guess, of cricket writing. I mean, we review many wonderful biographies, many wonderful books that sort of have higher aspirations, that talk about sort of the philosophy of the game, but actually just reporting on the game wonderfully, imaginatively and precisely as well. I mean, he's also equally at home talking about the technical side of the game. On on a very sort of niche point, and this I think happens when you read a chunk of a writer's work brought together. I chuckled when he, in two separate matches, a fielder picking up a ball at pace is on both occasions compared to a horseman picking up a handkerchief, and on one occasion it's a cowboy, and on one occasion it's a Cossack horseman. And I just thought this was a wonderful insight into how Ross's brain worked, that somewhere in his mind these mythical horsemen are flying around.
So that is Alan Ross's Cape Summer and the Australians in England. I don't even know if it's in print at the moment, but it is available on Kindle, which is how I read it, and it was once available in the Hull Library, which is how Andy read it via a now decommissioned copy. I assume purloined from a second-hand shop
stolen,
somewhere.
Yes.
And that was the 143rd episode of Reverse Swept Radio. Thanks for joining us. By the way, if there are any books that you particularly love that we haven't reviewed on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. You can always get in touch over on Twitter at Reverse Swept.